Marcus Washington's hands trembled slightly as he placed his worn military duffel on the floor of Galaxy Diner. The space station's artificial lighting buzzed overhead, casting harsh shadows across his tired face. 3 years since the war ended, and sleep still eluded him most nights. The memories of battle clung to him like the scent of smoke that never quite left his clothes. The diner was nothing special, just another stop on the outer rim of human space where different species mingled in uneasy peace. Cracked pleather booths lined the walls beneath windows that looked out into the endless void. Stars twinkled in the distance, beautiful and cold, just like the stares of the patrons inside. Marcus chose a corner booth, back to the wall, old habits from a soldier who had seen too much. His dark eyes scanned the room automatically, counting exits, noting potential threats. The military had trained him well, perhaps too well for civilian life. The few patrons, mostly aliens of various species, barely glanced his way as they hunched over their meals. All except the 2 Craxian security officers near the entrance, their scaled skin tensing as they spotted him. The Craxians were easy to recognize, tall, muscular beings with iridescent scales that shifted color with their moods. These 2 wore the gray-blue uniforms of station security, stun batons hanging from their belts. The taller one's scales rippled with a faint red pattern, suspicion, or perhaps hostility. A tired-looking waitress approached his table, her 4 arms moving independently as she balanced several plates and a coffee pot. "What'll it be?" she asked without looking up from her order pad. "Just coffee, please," Marcus replied softly. His voice was deep but gentle, contrasting with his large frame and the scars visible on his forearms. She poured the steaming liquid into a chipped mug and moved on without another word. Marcus wrapped his hands around the warm ceramic, grateful for its small comfort in this cold place. From his pocket, he pulled out a small medallion and placed it on the table beside his coffee, a small metal disc with unfamiliar markings etched into its surface. It was his ritual, a reminder of why he kept going when the nightmares became too much. The medallion caught the light, glinting briefly. That small flash of light was enough to catch the attention of the Craxian officers. The taller one nudged his partner and whispered something that made the younger officer's scales shift to a nervous blue-green. Marcus sipped his coffee, pretending not to notice their attention. He was used to it by now. The suspicion, the wariness. Humans weren't always welcome in the outer territories, especially not humans who carried themselves like soldiers. The war might be over on paper, but not in people's hearts. The taller Craxian pushed away from the wall and began moving toward Marcus's table. His hand rested casually on his stun baton, but there was nothing casual about his approach. The younger officer followed a step behind, looking distinctly uncomfortable. Around the diner, conversations quieted. A Zentari mother pulled her child closer to her side. An elderly Pulsan trader suddenly became very interested in the contents of his bowl. No one wanted trouble, and in their experience, humans often meant trouble. Marcus kept his eyes on his coffee. He could feel the weight of the Craxian's stare before the officer even reached his table. The medallion sat innocently beside his mug, its strange symbols catching the light. "Human," the officer growled, his translator making the word sound like an accusation. His scales had shifted to a deep crimson, now as he approached with his hand firmly gripped on his stun baton. The weapon made a soft humming sound as his fingers tensed around it. Identification. Now. The diner fell silent. Even the clatter of dishes from the kitchen stopped. The only sound was the faint hum of the station's life support systems and a Craxian's heavy breathing. Marcus looked up slowly, his face calm despite the tension radiating through his body. He'd faced worse than an aggressive security officer, much worse, but he had learned long ago that showing fear, or worse, anger, only escalated situations like this. The younger Craxian officer stood awkwardly behind his partner, scales shifting between nervous green and embarrassed purple. His eyes kept darting to Marcus's hands, to the medallion, and back to his partner's tense posture. Through the large viewport behind the officers, Marcus could see ships coming and going from the station, people with places to be, lives to lead. Once, he had fought to protect them all. Now, he just wanted to drink his coffee in peace. But peace, as Marcus knew too well, was often just the brief pause between conflicts. And as the silence stretched in the diner, with all eyes on him and the Craxian's hand tightening on his weapon, it seemed that even this small moment of quiet was coming to an end. "Sir, I'm just having breakfast," Marcus said softly, pushing his veteran's ID forward across the table. His fingers, scared from combat and repair work, lingered briefly on the worn edges of the identification card. The holographic emblem of the United Earth Defense Force caught the light, displaying his rank and service record in miniature glowing text. The officer snatched it with scaled fingers, holding it up to the light with obvious disdain. His partner stood awkwardly behind him, looking around at the silent diner patrons who pretended not to watch the confrontation. Humans, always trouble. The senior officer's translator made his voice sound even harsher than intended. He turned to his partner with a dismissive gesture. "This one claims to be military." The younger Craxian shifted uncomfortably, his scales rippling in shades of uncertain blue. He seemed to want to speak, but held his tongue as his senior officer examined the ID with exaggerated scrutiny. "Marcus Washington," the officer read aloud, his pronunciation mangling the human name. "Sergeant, Special Operations." He made a sound that the translator couldn't quite interpret, something between a scoff and a laugh. In one fluid motion, the Craxian tossed Marcus's ID onto the floor. It skittered across the polished surface, coming to rest beneath a nearby table. The human's expression didn't change, though a muscle tightened almost imperceptibly in his jaw. "Stand up," the officer demanded, taking a half-step back and placing his hand more firmly on his stun baton. "Empty your pockets." Around the diner, other patrons looked away, suddenly finding their meals fascinating. A group of Zentari merchants huddled closer together, their tendrils entwining in what Marcus recognized as a gesture of anxiety. At the counter, the four-armed waitress had stopped pouring coffee, watching the scene with tired eyes that had seen too many similar confrontations. Marcus slowly rose to his feet, keeping his hands visible in front of him. He stood taller than both Craxians, his broad shoulders and solid frame evidence of a life spent in military service. Yet there was no aggression in his posture, only a practiced calm, the kind that comes from experiencing far worse situations than an overzealous security check. "I have nothing to hide," Marcus said evenly, his eyes never leaving the officer's face. "But I would appreciate if you pick up my identification. I earned it." The senior officer's scales flashed a deep crimson. "You don't give orders here, human. This is our station now." Marcus understood the subtext immediately. This was about territory, about the recent peace treaty that had ended the war, but left many wounds unhealed. Some species, like the Craxians, had lost territory and pride in the conflict. This confrontation had little to do with him personally, and everything to do with what he represented. As Marcus stood with hands raised, the coffee in his mug had stopped steaming. Outside the viewport, a transport ship drifted past, its running lights blinking in the darkness of space. Life continued all around them, yet in this moment, time seemed suspended in the tense air of the diner. "I served with Craxian troops on Proxima," Marcus offered quietly, "under Commander Vexlar. Good soldiers." The mention of the respected commander seemed to further irritate the senior officer. "Don't speak our heroes' names," he snapped, his translator struggling to convey the full venom of his words. That's when the younger officer, who had remained silent throughout the exchange, noticed the medallion on the table. His eyes widened as they locked onto the small metal disc with its intricate engravings. Recognition dawned on his face, his scales shifting rapidly to a pale, almost white shade that indicated extreme surprise. "Sir, wait," he whispered urgently, reaching out to touch his superior's arm. The gesture was a breach of protocol that showed just how shaken he was. "Look at his table." The senior officer turned to rebuke his subordinate, but paused when he saw the younger Craxian's expression. Following his gaze, he too noticed the medallion sitting innocently beside the coffee mug. The disc gleamed under the harsh lighting, its surface etched with a symbol that both officers clearly recognized. Concentric circles surrounding a stylized flame, with 3 lines intersecting the center. It wasn't just any military decoration. It was something far rarer and more significant. The young officer's voice dropped even lower, but in the silence of the diner, everyone heard his next words clearly. "That's the medallion of Proxima 7, he said, his translator barely keeping up with his rapid speech. "Only awarded to those who—" He trailed off, seemingly unable to complete the thought. The senior officer's scales shifted from angry red to a confused mix of colors as he stared at the small object. For the first time, he looked at Marcus, really looked at him, taking in the human's face with new eyes. "Impossible," he muttered, but there was less certainty in his voice now. Marcus remained standing, hands still visible, his expression unchanged. But something subtle had shifted in the atmosphere of the diner. The other patrons were no longer pretending not to watch. All eyes were now openly fixed on the human and the medallion on his table, whispers beginning to circulate among them. The young officer bent down and carefully retrieved Marcus's fallen ID, holding it with newfound respect as he studied the name and service record again. When he looked up at Marcus, his expression had transformed completely. "Sir," he said, addressing Marcus rather than his superior, "may I ask where you served during the Battle of Proxima 7? "Impossible," the senior officer muttered, staring at the medallion as though it might vanish if he looked away. His scaled fingers twitched at his side, the earlier confidence draining from his posture. The medallion caught the light, its engraved surface telling a story that had become legend throughout the galaxy. The younger Craxian stood straighter, his spine stiffening as realization dawned fully on his face. His scales shifted to a reverent blue-gold pattern, a color combination Marcus had seen only during Craxian ceremonies honoring their greatest heroes. "You're the ghost of Proxima?" the young officer asked, his voice barely above a whisper yet somehow filling the entire diner. The question hung in the air for a moment. Across the diner, patrons who had been pretending not to watch now turned openly in their seats. The 4-armed waitress stopped mid-pour, coffee overflowing the cup she was filling. Even the cook emerged from the kitchen, spatula still in hand. The diner erupted in whispers. Species of all kinds leaned toward one another, pointing discreetly at Marcus and the medallion. The name Ghost of Proxima rippled through the room like a current. Marcus simply nodded. There was no pride in the gesture, only quiet acknowledgement of a truth he carried with him every day, heavier than any metal, more permanent than any scar. He saved 15,000 civilians during the Battle of Proxima. The young officer explained to his superior, his voice gaining strength with each word. "My family was there." The young Craxian's hand trembled slightly as he handed the ID back to Marcus with newfound respect. "My mother told me stories of a human who kept returning to the burning sectors when everyone else had given up. They called him the Ghost because he appeared and disappeared through smoke and fire, always carrying someone to safety." Memories flooded Marcus as the officer spoke, the burning colony with its atmosphere processors failing, toxic gas mixing with smoke, the desperate evacuation orders coming through broken comm systems, the faces of alien children, scales and skin alike, darkened with soot, eyes wide with terror as he carried them through collapsing corridors, the weight of small bodies in his arms, one after another, returning again and again despite his wounds, the searing pain as his support beam fell across his back on the 12th rescue run, the medics trying to keep him from going back in, the 16th run, the 20th. The senior officer's scales had paled to an ashen gray, but the stories say the Ghost died in the final collapse of the colony dome. Marcus rubbed the back of his neck where burn scars still marked his skin. "Nearly did," he said simply. His voice, though quiet, carried a weight that silenced even the whispers. "Got lucky." An old Zentari in the corner moved his hovering chair forward. The elderly alien's tendrils, once vibrant purple, now faded to pale lavender with age, trembled as he approached. His body bore the distinctive scaring of someone who had survived Proxima's burning atmosphere. He stopped his chair before Marcus and, with considerable effort, stood shakily. "I recognize you, human," the Zentari said, his translator giving the words a musical quality that couldn't hide the emotion behind them. "You carried my grandchild from the flames." The diner fell completely silent. Even the hum of the station seemed to fade away as the Zentari's tendrils reached out in the traditional gesture of profound gratitude. "She is now a scientist on our homeworld. Every day she lives is because of you." Marcus's eyes softened. He remembered every face, though he had rarely learned names in the chaos of that day. "I'm glad she's well," he said simply. The senior Craxian officer stepped back, his earlier aggression completely gone. "I don't understand," he said, looking between Marcus and the medallion. "If you're truly the ghost, why are you here? Alone? Without honor guard or recognition?" A sad smile touched the corners of Marcus's mouth. "The war's over," he said. "Ghosts belong to the past." From another table, a Pulsan trader with luminescent skin stood up. "That's him. All right. I was a transport pilot during the evacuation. Saw him carry out a family of 6 on his back when the oxygen levels were critical. Medical said his lungs should have collapsed, but he just kept going back in." More voices joined in, patrons from different tables, and various species adding their pieces to the story. The diner had transformed from a place of tension to something like a memorial hall, with Marcus at its reluctant center. "They said no human could survive those conditions," someone called out. "He broke through a security door with his bare hands when the systems failed," added another. The younger Craxian officer's scales now shimmered with emotion. "My mother said when the command ordered retreat, you disobeyed. Said you wouldn't leave while people were still trapped." Marcus looked down at his coffee, now cold in its mug. These stories always made him uncomfortable. He hadn't felt heroic that day, just desperate, angry at the thought of leaving anyone behind. "I just did what anyone would have done," he said quietly. The elderly Zentari's tendrils waved in gentle disagreement. "No," he said. "What you did, few would have chosen. Many could have. None but you did." The senior officer slowly removed his hand from his stun baton and placed it over his heart in the Craxian salute of highest respect. It was a gesture typically reserved for their own war heroes, never before offered to a human in public. "The ghost of Proxima," he said, his voice thick with emotion his translator couldn't quite convey. "I served in the cleanup operation after the evacuation. I saw the paths you cut through the wreckage. I counted the lives you saved." He bowed his head. "I have dishonored myself today." Marcus looked around the diner, at the faces turned toward him with awe and gratitude. This was why he traveled the outer stations, away from Earth and its parades and monuments. Out here, among those who had lived through the war, he wasn't a symbol or a recruitment poster. Here, his actions belonged to the people whose lives they had touched. "This can't be right," the senior officer stammered, his confident demeanor crumbling. His scales flickered between colors, unable to settle on a single emotion. "He's just a human." The words hung in the air, revealing more about the officer's worldview than he perhaps intended. In his mind, humans were simply not capable of the legendary actions attributed to the ghost of Proxima. The cognitive dissonance was written clearly across his face as he struggled to reconcile the stories with the quiet man standing before him. The young officer picked up Marcus's ID from where it had been returned, handling it now with reverence rather than suspicion. "Sir, look at his commendations," he said, turning the holographic display toward his superior. The list scrolled longer than the small display could accommodate. Distinguished Service Cross, Medal of Valor, Purple Heart with multiple clusters, and dozens more that flashed by too quickly to read. "These aren't just any commendations," the younger Craxian explained, his voice filled with awe. This is the record of someone who should have died 10 times over. More patrons approached Marcus's table, forming a loose circle around him. The atmosphere in the diner had transformed completely, from tense standoff to something approaching reverence. Each person who stepped forward had a story to share. A tall insectoid Vesperian clicked her mandibles together in their species' expression of deep respect. I served on a medical transport. We received many you rescued from Proxima. You were the human who stayed behind when others fled. A gruff-looking Terulian with rocky skin nodded in agreement. My brother served in the 45th Division. Said you disobeyed direct orders to save a group of Craxian civilians trapped behind enemy lines. That's right, confirmed another patron, their translucent body glowing faintly with emotion. My cousin was one of those civilians. The official report said the area was too dangerous for rescue operations, but you went anyway. The senior officer's scales had faded to an ashen gray, the Craxian equivalent of a human turning pale. His earlier bravado had vanished entirely, replaced by a growing realization of his mistake. Throughout it all, Marcus stood quietly, neither confirming nor denying the stories. His eyes carried a distant look, as though seeing not the diner around him, but the burning colony from years ago. The memories never truly left him. They merely waited beneath the surface, ready to emerge at moments like this. I don't understand, the young officer said, breaking the momentary silence. He looked at Marcus with genuine confusion. Why didn't you say something? When we approached you? When my superior? He trailed off, unwilling to directly reference the humiliation his senior had inflicted. Marcus gently touched his scarred hands, running his thumb across the burn marks that wrapped around his wrists and palms. Permanent reminders of melting control panels and superheated metal he pushed through to reach those trapped inside. The gesture was unconscious, a habit formed when memories became too vivid. Because heroes don't need to announce themselves, Marcus replied softly, his deep voice carrying easily in the now silent diner. And I'm not a hero. I'm just someone who couldn't walk away. The simplicity of his answer seemed to affect the gathered crowd more than any boast might have. Several patrons nodded in understanding, while others looked away, perhaps questioning what they would have done in similar circumstances. The senior officer's scales paled further with shame. His translator struggled to keep up as he spoke in his native language, emotion making his words hard to process. I didn't know, he finally managed, the translation coming through flat and inadequate for the complex feelings behind it. That's the problem, Marcus replied quietly, looking directly into the officer's eyes without judgment or anger. You saw what you expected to see. The truth of those simple words settled heavily on the room. It wasn't just about this particular Craxian officer or this specific human veteran. It was about the assumptions they all carried, the quick judgments made based on species or appearance rather than character. The cook, who had been listening from the doorway of the kitchen, stepped forward with a fresh pot of coffee. Without a word, he refilled Marcus's cup, then set the entire pot on the table, a small but meaningful gesture. My sister was stationed on Proxima, the cook said, his voice gruff with emotion. She said when the colony's shields failed and radiation started leaking in, you gave your protective gear to a group of children. Medics found you later with radiation burns across your back. Marcus took a sip of the fresh coffee, neither confirming nor denying the story. The scars beneath his shirt itched at the memory. The senior officer slowly removed his security badge and placed it on the table, a traditional Craxian gesture of making oneself vulnerable, admitting fault without defense. In my 20 years of service, he said, each word carefully chosen, I have learned to make quick judgments, to see threats before they become dangerous. He paused, struggling with what came next. Today I have learned that sometimes what we are trained to see blinds us to what is actually before us. Marcus studied the officer's face, seeing not just shame but genuine realization. He had encountered many like this Craxian before, those who had fought in the war and carried its prejudices forward into peace. Sometimes, moments like these were necessary bridges between the past and whatever future they might build together. "The war taught us all to see enemies," Marcus said, picking up his medallion and running his thumb across its surface. "Peace requires us to see people instead." Around them, the diner had become unexpectedly still, as though the station itself was holding its breath. In this small, unremarkable place, something important was happening, not just between a human veteran and a Craxian officer, but between all the different species present, each carrying their own memories and prejudices from the conflict that had nearly destroyed them all. The next morning, Marcus returned to the diner, expecting nothing more than a quiet breakfast. The events of the previous day had left him drained, as memories always did. He paused in the doorway, surprised to find both Craxian officers already there, standing stiffly beside his corner booth from yesterday. The senior officer's scales were set in a formal pattern, flattened against his body in a Craxian expression of deep regret. Beside him, the younger officer stood at attention, but his posture held anticipation rather than the rigid discipline of the day before. Several other patrons watched discreetly from their tables. News traveled quickly on space stations, where entertainment was limited and genuine heroes were rare. "We came to apologize," the senior officer said as Marcus approached. His translator conveyed the words plainly, but the formal posture of his scales spoke volumes more. In Craxian culture, such a display from a security officer to a civilian was almost unheard of. The young officer added, "And to learn." His scales rippled with an eager blue pattern. "If you're willing." Marcus studied them both for a moment. He had seen enough conflict to know when someone offered a genuine olive branch. He gestured for them to sit. "Then let's talk." The two Craxians slid into the booth opposite him. The four-armed waitress appeared almost immediately with coffee for Marcus and steaming cups of something green for the officers. She gave Marcus a small nod, a look that suggested she too had heard the stories overnight. "I served 3 tours before Proxima," the senior officer began, staring into his cup. "In the beginning, we were told humans were savages, that you understood only force." He looked up, meeting Marcus's eyes. "When the war ended, I didn't know how to stop seeing enemies." Marcus nodded. "That's the hardest part of any war. Coming home." As they spoke, their conversation drew attention. A Zentari family approached cautiously. The father bowed his tendrils in respect before speaking. "My children have learned about Proxima in their studies," he explained. "When we heard the ghost was here." He trailed off, embarrassed by his boldness. Marcus smiled gently at the children, their purple tendrils wiggling with excitement. "Join us, if you'd like." Soon, others gathered around the expanding table. The diner's owner, seeing what was happening, pushed several tables together to accommodate everyone. Human merchants, Craxian workers, Centauri families, and species Marcus couldn't even name pulled up chairs. Former enemies now sat elbow to tentacle, sharing space and stories. "Is it true you carried 17 children in one trip?" asked a wide-eyed human child, clearly repeating a tall tale she'd heard. Marcus laughed, the sound surprising even himself. "Not quite. The most was 3. Any more, and I would have dropped them all." The senior Craxian officer watched Marcus intently. "Our military academies teach the Proxima evacuation as a case study in impossible scenarios. They say no one should have survived those conditions." "Many didn't," Marcus said quietly. The table fell silent, honoring the unspoken names. A young Pulsan with shimmering skin raised her hand hesitantly. "How did you find the courage?" she asked, her translator giving the words a musical quality. "When everyone else gave up." Marcus touched his medallion, which now lay openly on the table between them all. The simple disc caught the light, throwing tiny reflections across the gathered faces. In that moment, it seemed to connect them all. A small piece of history they shared, regardless of species or past allegiances. "It was never about courage," Marcus replied thoughtfully. "It was about seeing each other as people worth saving." He looked around at the gathered faces, scaled, tentacled, furred, and smooth, each watching him with different eyes but the same attention. In the worst moments, When the flames were highest and the air was failing, I stopped seeing Craxians or Zentari or humans. I just saw people who wanted to live, who had families waiting, who deserved a chance. Marcus ran a finger along the edge of his medallion. That's all any of us are, beneath our differences. The young Craxian officer leaned forward. Our histories teach that humans were physically weaker than most species in the galaxy, that your technology was less advanced, that you should have lost the war. By all logical measures, yes, Marcus agreed. Then how did you survive? How did your species emerge as leaders in the peace? Marcus considered the question carefully. Outside the diner's viewport, stars stretched endlessly against the black canvas of space. Transport ships and personal vessels moved between them, carrying people to new worlds, new opportunities, new chances to be better than they were yesterday. The station itself was a miracle of cooperation, built by species who had once tried to destroy each other, now working together towards something greater than any could achieve alone. That, Marcus smiled, meeting each pair of eyes around the table, is humanity's greatest strength. We've never been the strongest or the smartest, but we've always been able to look at someone different from ourselves and see not an enemy, but a potential friend. He gestured to their gathered group, human, Craxian, Zentari, and a dozen other species, sharing coffee and conversation where yesterday there had been only suspicion. This is the real victory, he said softly. Not the battles we won, but the peace we build together. The senior Craxian officer's scales shifted to a deep blue of understanding. He raised his cup in a toast, a human gesture he must have learned recently. To seeing each other, he said. Around the table, cups, tentacles, and hands of all shapes raised in response. To seeing each other, they echoed. As the morning continued, more station residents came and went. Stories were shared, not just of the war, but of lives being built in its aftermath. Children played beneath tables while parents who might once have been enemies found common ground in their hopes for the future. And Marcus Washington, once known as the Ghost of Proxima, found something he hadn't expected in this forgotten corner of space, not just recognition for his past, but a glimpse of the future he had fought to make possible. A future where the boundaries between species mattered less than the connections between individuals. It wasn't perfect. The scars of war, both physical and emotional, would never fully heal. But as he watched former enemies laughing together over breakfast, Marcus thought perhaps this imperfect peace was worth all the pain it had taken to achieve. And that was enough.